Cool.
All right. Well, I see our faces in OBS, and shortly thereafter, there they are on Twitch. So I think people can hear us and see us now. So good evening. I can say evening for you. Good evening, Jim. How
You
are you?
can. It's dark outside. It's 7 o'clock in the evening over here.
Oof.
So you can say good evening, and I'll
Yeah.
say good afternoon to you.
It is afternoon, and we're in my part of the world. There are these winter storm warnings. We're gonna get some amount of snow over the next period of time, and depending on what point you look at your weather app, that's either going to be, oh my gosh, 10 to 18 inches of snow in the next 12 hours. It could be 4 to 8 inches in the next 72 hours. We'll just have to wait and see. And it's the joy of living in Minnesota in February. So,
Sounds delightful. We just had the biggest storms that we've had in probably 20 or 30 years here, but they're not like yours. I've lost a few fence panels, and that's it. It's kind of very British. It's not very
well,
it's very understated for a storm.
it's fine. I did see something on Twitter of someone filming planes landing at Heathrow and having to come in at these crazy angles and I've been on a few of those flights where you are very thankful that the pilots know what they're doing, or you hope they know what they're doing,
Absolutely.
right? Not a lot of fun when they got to wave around and you do that again and you're bouncing in the seats, but ooh,
I
no, thank
saw,
you.
I saw, I don't know if it was true, but I want it to be true, a kind of similar sketch of that, but some CCTV of a pub with the whole pub watching these planes coming in at like 45 degrees, and every time it landed, it's like, "Ah!" And I just want that not to be fake because it looked great fun.
See, I could see him putting bets on that, can't you? There
Yeah,
had
I,
to be a
I can
betting app
too. We
going.
are.
Yeah,
We're
yeah, without a
incorrigible
doubt.
people over here.
100%, 100%. It's the only way to go.
Uh,
Well, happy President's Day to you. It is President's Day here in the U.S. I don't entirely know what that holiday means, other than a smidgen of people have the day off. But you were saying earlier, it was been a nice quiet day for you.
It has, because you lot are having President's Day, so half my
There you go.
company are off work, enjoying themselves hopefully today.
See,
So it's
see.
quiet. Normally, when my afternoon starts and you folks wake up in the morning, my whole screen lights up with fun things or less fun things happening. So it's quite nice. It's been quite a quiet day. I've been actually sitting around writing a technical book in relative
No.
peace and quiet. It's been quite good fun.
Well, you are welcome for that. See, the overriding message to me of President's Day is this is when lots of companies have sales. President's Day sales, for car. Well, not for cars this year because you can't get your hands on a car. There's no sale price on a car, but furniture and mattresses and every outlet has their President's Day sale. So it's
Do you
good
ever
fun.
think like the vice presidents feel a bit left out?
Probably a little bit, yeah. I mean, well, maybe it's more of a ceremonial role. I don't know. It depends on who you ask. It depends on which administration. Let's be honest. Some administrations, I think the vice president was a little more powerful than other administrations. Let's just say that.
Your political system is baffling to me. I mean, my political system looks like Hogwarts to you, and that's us.
Is that how you pick your next monarch? Is there a sorting hat
Yeah,
involved?
that's right. We the next prime minister, we put a hat on them,
Checks
and
out.
some Latin gets spoken, and then that's the new boss.
Sure, that makes sense.
Yeah,
That makes sense.
yeah, it just sort of works. It's pretty
Yeah,
efficient.
yeah. Well, I do wish the queen well. I hope that she recovers quickly from COVID. So
Her Majesty appreciates your message of goodwill, and
I'm
she
sure she
will
does.
withdraw the redcoats from your eastern seaboard
We
based on
appreciate
that.
that. We appreciate
That's
that, and
fine.
and we'll continue to negotiate on those back taxes. Don't worry.
You can
So
pay
you,
us, or we can teach you cricket. Those are your choices.
oh, I have tried on more than one occasion to get my head wrapped around cricket. This game is inscrutable, and I love sports. I watched curling during the Winter Olympics. Curling,
Wow.
which, as I understand it, started in Scotland. They would slide these stones down frozen causeways, and that was the sport. And so but I cannot get my head wrapped around cricket, and I've had multiple people attempt to explain it to me. I've attempted to watch cricket multiple times. I have read the rules multiple times. Is it a cultural thing? Do you have to grow up with it? Is it because of the tea? Do you have to drink tea in order to enjoy
I have
it?
no idea. I think all of
Okay,
those things possibly, but when we were kids, we'd play it in the street, right?
sure.
But no, I mean, like, I, it's not such a big sport here, right? You watch it when there's nothing else on. But
Sure.
it's often quite fun if it's a big international game. So if the Indians or the Australians are playing
Yep.
with kind of like world-class teams, it's often like quite a lot of fun. But no, you're right, it is inscrutable, and the rules have funny names like, oh, we're going to invoke the Duckworth-Lewis rule. True rule. I'm not even making that one up, to decide who wins a game because it's been raining too much.
Oh,
I'm not even joking, right?
okay.
No, I think for most sort of fans that would go there, I think they like the idea of sitting in the sunshine with a
Sure.
cold beer, and you can do that for 5 days. So if you ever get
Right.
to see England versus West Indies in the West Indies, doesn't that just sound lovely?
That
Like
does.
a
That
week
does.
sitting in the sunshine in Barbados or Trinidad or something, cold beer, watching a game that doesn't really move in any way that excites you to, move anything, the odd clap,
And and if you
another
take a
beer.
nap, you haven't missed anything.
You haven't missed
So,
much. That's the thing.
yeah.
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 Well, okay, so I think I know what you and I should strive to
But
do in 22 or
but you
23. Well,
you have baseball for that, right?
oh,
And
100%.
like warm summer game that goes on for a few hours,
Yes.
beers in the sunshine,
Yes.
lovely. I feel the same for baseball. I have no idea what's going on, but when the beer dude comes past, I'm like, yes, please, and that feels great.
Mm-hmm. Well, that is a good point, and I think that some of these sports clearly being there live is much better than watching it on TV. You know, I don't feel that way about American football. American football is much better on TV as far as I'm concerned, and I've had season tickets to my home team, the Minnesota Vikings, and I've attended many games live. I've watched plenty of games. Much better to watch on TV. But baseball, hockey, perhaps cricket makes much more sense and is more enjoyable in the stadium itself, in my opinion.
I guess so. I think, yeah, particularly if it's warm and sunny. Not that we get much of that here. So
When will summer be this year? Is it will do you, have you designated yet? Do you have a
we're
prediction?
not sure, but we think it might be July the 17th and 18th
Okay.
this year.
Okay.
That's
All
that's
right.
where the smart money is.
Fantastic. Because I know I was in London in May once and I was shocked that it was sunny and warm, and I really did not know how to handle this because I was genuinely worried about getting a sunburn. That's how sunny it was, and that's not something I've ever thought about being in the UK, and I've been there a lot. So
It's quite lovely. Like when that happens, and all kidding aside, it does happen.
yeah,
The whole mood of the city lifts,
yeah,
right? Coming
yeah.
out of kind of an extended autumn that we call winter. When that sunshine creeps around in kind of April, May time, and it's 25 Celsius or something, everyone's in such a good mood.
Yes,
And
yes,
while that lasts, it's a wonderful place to be, because our normally grumpy and curmudgeonly demeanors evaporate, right? And suddenly everyone's your friend, and it's all very jolly. But then it goes, then the grey clouds roll in, a few days later, and everyone's back to being grumpy and you know uh, basically hostile to all
yeah.
other human
That's
beings.
fair.
Yeah.
That's fair. Minnesota suffers from the same thing. I mean, we have these months known as January and February where it is cold and it is snowy. You know, again, we are going to get some amount of snow in the next 24 to 48 hours, so that'll be fascinating. But yeah, when that first warm day hits in March, well, yesterday it was in the mid 40s, which I don't know what is that, like 9-10 degrees Celsius. I mean, it was actually very pleasant compared to the 0 it was a few days previous. And of course, today again, it's like single digits. So, just if you're ever bored, just wait a couple days. The weather will change, or a couple
you should
hours in
you
some
should be able to
cases.
deal with it, right? You're all
Oh yeah,
Scandinavian stock, aren't you?
yeah. Oh yeah. This I do wonder about my ancestors. Like, why did you settle here? Did you not like the more temperate climates of the coast, or
Just like home, right?
100%. The first time I ever visited Sweden, I it was early spring here in Minnesota, and so it was already snow was melted. It was nice, and then I landed there, and there was snow again, and I looked around, and I went, "Yep, nope, I get it. I completely understand." If you would have blindfolded me and just like snapped my fingers, and now I'm there, I would not have realized that I had moved, because it is incredibly similar. So,
I,
as a total aside on that trip, I can't remember which city I was in. It wasn't Stockholm. My wife was with me and we were doing some touristy stuff, and we stopped at this church and we walked into the church, and I had nothing on that was identifying. I just had on like a red jacket. Christine didn't have anything that was identifying. And these folks were sitting having a little coffee at their table, whatever, having a little chit chat. And they looked up, and this guy looked at us and said, and of course, perfect English, "So are you folks from Minnesota then?" And I just kind of looked at my wife, and we hadn't said anything. I wasn't wearing like a Minnesota Gophers hat or a Twins hat or anything. And I'm just like, well, that's a little scary. I mean, is it just do we look Minnesotan? Is that a thing? I mean, I know people say you sound Minnesotan sometimes, but anyway, that's neither here nor there. Now, I know this is the kind of intellectually titillating stuff people come to hear us talk about, but I think we should talk about technology. You and I were talking about this in the pre-show. We did the sort of rambling socially issues and background issues last time, and I think we hit on a good topic for a good mine for us to dig into here, and that's around this whole database explosion that we've seen in the last 10, 15, 20 years in
Yeah.
software. When you and I were young engineers, you had a relational database, or you had a hierarchical database, and that was it. And you were happy, and you got everything done with DB2. You had DB2 or DB2. And now, as an engineer, as an architect, you have the paradox of choice. You got all the SQL databases, the NoSQL databases, everything in between. So the first question I'd throw out at you is, to what do you attribute this thousand flowers blooming in the database space? And then once we kind of get through that, I'm curious for your thoughts on how you make a decision about what type of database makes sense for a project.
Yeah. That I've been pondering this. I've lived in this world for like 12 years now, permanently, as a kind of database engineer and vendor and so on. And I thought I knew the answer to this, and it's somewhat the answer, but it feels a bit superficial. And one of the answers is, and when you and I were, as you say, youngsters, first database I ever used was Ingress, and there was no SQL. That was in there was an absence of SQL. We used a relational calculus syntax to interact with it, and that blew me away. I thought that was brilliant. By the time I got to SQL, I'm like, oh God, this is horrible. Get me back my relational calculus. Not even relational algebra, relational calculus.
Right.
Right, but that sort of made sense to me. And as I kind of weaned myself onto building, digitizing systems for people, the relational thing was everywhere, and it was perhaps a bit more choice than you would have us have. I could have SQL Server or DB2 or
Right.
Oracle by that
Right.
point, right? So it was a bit of a smorgasbord. There you go, as a
Right.
scam for you of relational kit. And for me, one thing always troubled me. I remember being very clearly doing my PhD, so I was in grad school, as you would call it, and teaching some undergrads about databases. And someone engaged me in some conversation around join tables. And for some reason, my brain fixated on this. And I'm like, hey, why do we need these? And the
Mm-hmm.
professor that was kind of leading the teaching at the time said, well, yeah, obviously we did, and he extolled the correct reasons. But I'm like, but isn't this teaching the database how to do its job?
Right.
And he's like, yeah, well, possibly, but can you just get on with the teaching now, because these people need to be trained and they need to pass their exams. And that lodged in my brain. I mean, kind of, having come from a place where I really enjoyed working with Ingress and relational calculus, to a place now where I was kind of fixated on, why am I telling the database how to do its job? This join table does not serve me any good purpose, but it's necessary for me to make my model work. And that
Right.
bothered me, right? So anyway, I went off into the wild blue yonder and did other stuff for a while. Did transaction processing and stuff that wasn't specifically database, but it was kind of distributed systems, which I'll come back to. But it has a slight overlap with database, right? So
Yeah.
both sides have transactions. So I'm off doing transaction processing, and then some kind of with ThoughtWorks, I guess, where when I met you, so sort of figuring out business information systems and trying to make that better. And somewhere along that point, what we now think of as the web hyperscalers, they clearly decided that some of the things in the relational world were worth sacrificing in order to gain other benefits. So I'm thinking
Sure.
particularly about Dynamo, right? That was the first, if we think about the first modern, well-known NoSQL database, as they came to be known, 2005. And in Dynamo, the idea was, we need somewhere to store shopping carts. And we don't need to, select blah from blah, outer join blah, blah, blah on shopping carts. That's not our main drive. That's not our main requirement. Our main requirement is that you should always be able to add to a shopping cart, because that's the
Sure.
heart of the business. And so that was interesting, right? Because I think Dynamo was it must have been, I'd love to talk to the Amazon folks that built it, because it must have been quite a scary thing to do, to say
Right.
at that point, I'm going to build a new database, and it's not going to be a relational database, because while I might value the modeling idioms that SQL give me, I value the availability characteristics of a key value store more. And
Right.
we're old enough that you can imagine being in that room and it being a really tense conversation. Here
Right.
where we sit in 2022, it's an obvious thing, right? Or an almost obvious thing. We take it for granted. There are lots of those databases around. They're doing really useful stuff. But back in 2005, or in fact, pre-2005, right? Because their paper came out in 2005 to say, we're not going to use Oracle for this. Must have been an amazingly brave thing to do and an amazingly insightful thing to do. So that kicks off, right? Dynamo kicks off. It says we value availability over expressivity effectively, right? Because I think it's fairly obvious. Keys and values are less expressive than the richness that's built up around a relational model, let alone all of the languages and tooling that have built up around that model over the years. And the brilliant engineering that's gone into things like Oracle and SQL Server, right? So Dynamo kicks off. Then Bigtable comes along and says, it's kind of like Dynamo, but the data model's a bit richer. Now we've kind of got columns that will sort of help you structure your data a bit more, but still maintain that lovely kind of high availability, high scale characteristic that we want from Dynamo. And now kind of from it being a trickle, the floodgates have opened.
Right.
The clones rush in, right? And we're seeing things like Apache Cassandra. We're seeing things like, you remember REAC from the old days?
Oh,
wonderful REAC, and more latterly things like Aerospike, Tokyo Cabinet, so on. And then in order to, on top of that, again, you see the opportunity. Well, columns are nice, but wouldn't it be nice if this just worked like a filing cabinet? And then we see things like CouchDB, nowadays Couchbase, MongoDB, probably the most successful of the NoSQL databases around there, all of which are trying to sacrifice some level of expressiveness for some other more desirable characteristic in their world, right? Typically scale and availability, because these are systems that aim to be behind some very large scale, typically internet facing systems, right? And I think this was in that really kind of energetic period like 2005 to 2012 where this was really shaking down. It was incredible, the amount of things that people were trying, failing. It just exploded to the point where nowadays there's been a bit of a shakedown, right? In my world now, I think about MongoDB and Cassandra and Redis and Neo4j, right? They're the ones that have kind of made it across some boundary. But
to the valley
running up
beyond.
to that, it could have gone anywhere, right? There was like this Cambrian explosion of not only models, time series and KV and documents and so on, but also companies trying to support that model in a myriad of different ways. And so there was, as you say, 1,000 flowers bloomed, and now it's kind of we were kind of heading towards more of a narrowing of the gene line right now with a few commercial winners. But even so, commercial things aside, that growth, if I could put it pithily, that growth of choice has been because we found that we preferred some characteristic of a data store over some other characteristic, starting with availability over expressivity. But nowadays, a whole, whatever you like, I'm a graph database person, so I prefer the ability to talk in terms of graphs or connected entities over reasoning in sets like I would in SQL, that kind of stuff. And so we're all making these kind of trade-offs, right, in order to find the right kind of database, if our system needs a database, to put into our system, the one that reduces our intellectual burden and the semantic gap between, our kind of domain, the real world domain, and what we're doing in code.
So do you think some of that was sort of like the banister effect of once he broke the 4-minute mile, then almost immediately, I mean, I don't remember the exact statistic, right? But he broke the 4-minute mile, which, no one can do that. And then bam, 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 like right afterwards, a bunch of people did it. And now it's not considered that big of a deal. I mean, if you're an elite miler, of course you run under 4 minutes. That's just crazy. I mean, so do you feel like that had something to do with it? That once one person was willing or one organization was willing to, we don't need to be constrained by that set of choices. We actually can try this, and here we go. It works out pretty well.
Yeah, I think knowing that something's possible is really helpful, right? So, like, let's say, okay, I don't believe with my pitiful knowledge of physics that teleportation is possible, so I won't even try. But then, we find some alien artifact on the moon, which is a teleporter, and I don't really understand it. But now I know it's possible. It gives you the confidence to try these things in a way that you wouldn't have before. You would have dismissed it out of hand. And of course, we're both old enough that we did dismiss it out of hand for a long time, right? We had the database, which really meant, nowadays we have to say the relational database. We had a reasonably limited choice of proprietary closed source, relatively expensive bits of software, and then latterly, things like Postgres and MySQL and so on. But that was the choice. And knowing that another world was possible, I think it gave a lot of people like, hey, I can try this. And look, many of us failed, right?
Right.
These are now footnotes in the history of the database industry. But I think without the lead that the Amazon and latterly the Google folks took that showed us it was possible, we still perhaps wouldn't have moved on from that, because no disrespect to the relational database folks, what they've done is amazing, right?
Yeah.
Over like 40, 50 years, like not only is the tech good, like the kind of engineering stuff that folks like you and I might work on, but the academic research, the stuff that goes on in universities is amazing, right? The kind of richness and utility of the stuff that's come out of that community is fantastic. And so it would be so easy to stay in that world, because eventually the relational researchers are going to conquer whatever problem you think you have, be it availability or connectivity or what have you, or they're going to get there. And then SQL is going to slurp that in. SQL speaks XML, SQL speaks JSON. SQL is like an acquisitive language, right? It absorbs all of the things that you want into itself. It's like the Borg. You will all be part of SQL eventually, because the underlying engines really are good, right? I'm not gonna, for commercial gain, say that they're terrible, because they're not. They're good, and the people behind them are good. I wish I could say for commercial gain they're terrible, but people are watching this now, and it wouldn't ring true.
Right.
But having said that, the other point you asked, it's like, well, why then? Why have these things sustained? And I think it's because it's a matter of right tool for the right job. Look, relational is great, but it isn't universal, despite what some of the kind of apostles of Stonebreaker might tell us. It really isn't. Like, some of the things that I can express really easily in terms of, say, my availability requirements for a shopping cart system in Dynamo, they're a pain in the butt to do in MySQL or Postgres. Right? It's doable, but it's like, I've got all this other stuff that's superfluous, right? Why am I wasting system efficiency on that stuff? Or in my world, in Graph, you're trying to do connections between entities, which is quite normal and cheap and trivial in Graph. That's a pain in the butt if you try and do that in a key value store or in a relational store. And so in a way, back in the day when we were at university, we were taught algorithms and data structures.
Yep.
And we learned, okay, use this kind of algorithm in this situation and pair it with this kind of data structure, right? And that was that kind of our design space. And this is another instance of that, I think. If you're building a high availability shopping cart, then your data design space skews one way. If you're building something where you want to find out about, if you want to run payroll, then your data architecture skews it another way. And if you're trying to figure out, we're talking about flights, we're hopefully going to travel again. If you want to figure out airline mappings around the planet and lowest carbon or lowest cost or blah, 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 then that's a completely different kind of data architecture you're going to end up with. And it turns out now that finally a lot of the hyperbole has died down in the kind of NoSQL world, that people are now able to make pretty good, clear choices about what their data looks like and pick a database that's the best fit.
Well, and I think it's even learning that some of these tools exist. You think about some stuff you do around the house, and it's like, wow, this would be really easy if there was a tool. Oh, wait, there is. And, once you know that it exists, all of a sudden this thing that maybe took you all afternoon, well, you just make this little jig and then now the problem's solved almost instantaneously. So part of that, I think, is just that willingness to examine that problem space and realize that, well, no, I don't just have to use the sledgehammer. I could use a different kind of hammer, and that might help me solve this problem more efficiently. And realizing there's different trade-offs. That, as an architect, that's the whole game. It's just the trade-offs. There's no best solution. There's no worst solution. Well, sometimes there's a worse solution, I guess, but
there can be
certainly
bad solutions, right?
Sure. But a lot of times it ends up being, well, what's the least worst solution, and what are those trade-offs? Knowing that, well, if I need availability, then I'm gonna have to give up something else in order to make that happen.
Yeah. In the pathological case as well, right? That's another thing about, when you're architecting systems, it's very easy to get sucked in. So along with the growth of NoSQL came the fleeting popularity of CAP theorem. Now, CAP theorem is a useful theorem, but Brewer went on to do much more useful stuff around harvest and yield. But this is where I think the second train of thought that I had earlier kind of collides with the distributed systems community collided with the database community, and that's really what gave us these new set of systems. Because traditionally they were separate, right? The distributed systems community were over here, and they were worried about fault tolerance and Byzantine generals problem and this kind of stuff. And indeed, eventually, the CAP theorem: can I have a system which is consistent, available, and partition tolerant? And it turns out probably not. In the pathological case. In the cases, you probably can, but in the pathological case, no. And meanwhile, the database people are over here, and they're actually generally thinking about single image systems, right? So for them, a transaction is something that's dependably flushed to disk so that it's recoverable. Over here in distributed systems world, a transaction, as I learned it under the folks at Arduino, which became JBoss, which became Red Hat, a transaction is the ability to manipulate multiple objects and then have the changes to those objects atomically and durably persisted. And that's very different from the database view of the world, right? Because the world that I was living in the distributed systems world was either Corba or J2EE. If you remember that
I'm old enough for both of those, buddy.
But they'd use the same word, because the database folks would say transaction, and they would say things like ACID. And over in distributed systems world, they would say transaction, and they would say things like ACID. And it turns out when you bring them together, they are talking past each other. Right. And it's taken us this decade of shaking out. Wait a minute, when the Basho folks who built React, when they say consistency, did they mean the same as the Oracle? No, they don't, because the Oracle guys mean if you switch the power off and on again, your database comes up and it hasn't broken. Whereas over here, they mean two different servers will give you the same answer or not. And so we've sort of talked past each other for a decade, which has been remarkable. And I'm as guilty as anyone else, living in a database company, but being a kind of distributed systems background. Even I've been baffled by this. So I think it's nice that all of this sort of kerfuffle and nonsense and FUD is slowly dying down now. And we're seeing, I think, a healthy convergence of the database community and the distributed systems community, because all future databases will be distributed. 90% of future databases will be distributed.
Well, and I think the other interesting context here is the shift that we've seen towards these more distributed architectures, and the fact that you go back to the late 90s. If you would have gone to your infrastructure people and said, listen, what I really need to do is stand up, I don't know, maybe 1,500 instances of the app server. Your vendor would have been delighted, because that would have been serious coin, but your infrastructure people would have never spoken to you again. Like that's impossible. But it is possible now. And that same sort of context, that having that governor, that constraint removed, means that it's no longer the situation where we have one kind of database because that's the one that we're going to stand up for the company. If your team needs a different kind of database, that is something we can now stand up for you, and it isn't this massive infrastructure and massive overhead of maintaining it. I think that helps play a part in this too.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, virtualization has revolutionized the industry, right? It's sort of it's really odd now in my real life where things aren't immediately elastic and turn off and on. Right. I have to remember that the real world has these inelastic properties.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a thing? Yeah.
You hit these limits now, and you kind of feel stupid because you realize the real world is probably a more realistic thing to
Supply chains might be a perfect example of that.
Why aren't there enough new cars in America, right? Why aren't they just elastic? Can't you just turn the slider and more cars pop? No.
Right.
So I think that's definitely one thing. Something that troubles me about this, right? This is weird. Now I keep saying that we're old enough for this, and we are, and it's this isn't meant to be some kind of like old blokes chit chat, but we're not old enough for this. Remember, like back in the day, IBM said that the world will only need like 5 computers. Right? Do you remember that kind of famous meme? It still exists. Right. We are thankfully too young for that, but not by much. And we all laughed at that because the microcomputer happened, and then client server happened, and then there's this rich tapestry of distributed system stuff going on. If you talk to people who work at Amazon or Google or Ali or Tencent or any of those folks, there is like crazy, gazillion computers with a gazillion virtualization gadgetry on top of it, right? And it's definitely more than 5. But if you zoom out, IBM were right, because I've got Google, Google, Amazon, Microsoft,
Azure.
Tencent,
Yeah.
Ali, possibly Huawei. But okay, approximately 5 computers in the
Right.
world now,
Right.
which is sort of interesting, right?
Within
That
the margin of
despite the
error.
fact, yeah, within the margin of error, we've now got 5 effectively computers
Right.
in the world. And so they were right. They were just completely wrong about how those computers would be physically built. And those
Right.
computers are physically built from lots of different things that we call servers and virtualized servers. They're not built lots of different motherboards wired together. But there
Right.
are, probably single digit number in the world computers. They were right. And that is delightful and horrifying.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm fond of talking about cloud. The fact that what's a real high level definition of cloud? It's a big pile of compute. I shave off what you need. I charge you for what you use. And I usually like to remind people that if you've been in this industry long enough, that sounds awfully darn familiar. It
Yeah.
is essentially a rebranding, a reemergence of the mainframe with radically different implementation details, but it's the same basic concept of a big pile of compute. We shave off what you need, we charge you for what you use. Now, again, there are significant differences between the two, but conceptually, same ballpark. And I think it's part of what I find so fascinating about this industry is how quickly these kinds of things happen and change. I mean, it's not like you and I are looking back as old men with a snifter of whiskey, although that would be fine too. The kids these days with their punch cards, but it's amazing to see how much shift has happened in just the last 10 years. And it really does make me like, what are the next 10 years going to have for us?
Sure.
And wow, because there's that Gates quote, right, about people overestimate the amount of change that happens in 2 years and underestimate the amount of change in 10, or paraphrasing. But I think it's going to be really interesting to see what software looks like in 5, 10, 15 years.
Yeah, I mean, we can't know, right? But
No.
at least we know what we know the trend is today
Yes.
is that
Yeah.
it's increasingly the building blocks of software are going to be services that other people manage on our behalf. I think that
Yeah.
that's an increasing trend. Not only in the kind of middleware or data sphere where I live, but across the board, right? You're seeing
Right.
all sorts of useful application building blocks out there that will help you get the holy grail in a way: focus on business value, get the tech out of
Yep.
the way. I don't think that's ever as clean as the proponents make out. The tech always gets its tendrils in some way because there's tech there, right? But
Right.
it's increasingly we're heading towards a system where personally I own very minimal amounts of infrastructure and hopefully minimal amounts of code. And then there are these building blocks that I pay by the gigabyte hour or whatever
Mm-hmm.
for, and that's how my systems are going to be built. What I, as a kind of old school person, don't understand in that transition is like, or maybe it's a comfort blanket I want to hold on to. It's like I used to be able to bring this up on my laptop to test it,
Right.
and that's something which the cloud providers are quite good at. That they're like, well, it's the same, just bring it up on the cloud to test it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a real edge case. But I used to be able to go on an aeroplane and still
Right.
write software in the way that I
Right.
would if I was in an office. Whereas, of course, that's less likely to happen. So I don't know what's going to happen. I'm no longer really in the kind of digitization space, which I feel is driving consumption of those patterns. But certainly where I live, down in the weeds at the bottom of the stack, that is the direction of travel. There are fewer and fewer people who want to buy a database and install it on a server. That's
Right.
just that's pain they don't want anymore. They want the data model and they want insights into their data, but they don't want to double click install.exe anymore and have that
Right.
pain.
Right. Well, and that's interesting because we see that same force in the physical world too. I've got a new car in the fall, and of course, I had to reserve it months in advance. Basically, I put money down way before the car showed up, and the delivery date was supposed to be one thing, and it became something very different by the time the car actually arrived here in Twin Cities. Part of that having to do with, amazingly enough, they shut down a rail line because there was an accident, and so they like the train just couldn't go east. Sorry, so that it's sat there for like a week. But you can short-term lease a car, and at one level that's literally car as a subscription. That is an option now for multiple car companies where you pay whatever it is a month, and basically every few weeks, if you want, you can drive back and say, here's the keys, give me a different one, and then drive out with a different car. And of course, now that's gone even further than in certain large cities. You wouldn't need to own a car at all because you tap a button on your phone and a car just appears. Now that's not evenly distributed, obviously, but we are, I think, evolving towards that and it'll be interesting to see what the consequences of that are writ large. But yeah, I think you're right that these abstractions are getting larger. The things that we used to, well, of course you need to run your own X. Like, well, no, actually, you really don't. That should be somebody else's problem, not yours.
Although, and I don't know if this trend is strong, there are now people who are doing, I think, thoughtful analysis of their billings to large cloud providers and saying actually it's cheaper for the kind of workloads we run, it's cheaper to own our own kit. But I wonder if
Sure.
that's more akin to the kind of, the people who would build their own cars as kind of kit car enthusiasts rather than the
Right.
mainstream of people who just want to subscribe to a car in a way. The car subscription thing I think is really fascinating because it's very inelastic, and yet
Right.
up until recently with modern supply chains that was possible. And
Right.
what we found in the supply chain or supply graph, as it really is, the supply graph world, because it's not just a list, is it? It's a complex web of
Right. Right.
dependencies. So yeah, I'm just now I'm shilling for
It's
graphs
it's graph databases all the way down, is what you're
all the
saying.
way down. But in the modern supply graph, that was modern supply network, I guess. Yeah, it was interesting that a shock like COVID could prevent, transitively prevent elasticity at a kind of consumer level. And that's something that in purely in IT world, if you ignore the global shortage of chips, we're still not used to that, right? We've never
Right.
really been stunted by that in the way that the physical world have. Your train was delayed. In IT, I have multiple redundant networks, and they are
Right.
also provisionable to some IOPS or some throughput of my choosing, depending on how much I want to pay. We've never felt that pain. But of course, at some point, that world and our world do intersect.
Right.
And I do wonder whether we've got the kind of patterns in place for that. If should that kind of thing, maybe it's once in a generation, once in a century, so should it happen again?
Well, although a ship gets stuck in a canal and things come to a screeching halt, not just for a couple days, but really for weeks, because that just backs everything up outside of that. And
Yeah, yeah.
I know as human beings, we're really bad at sort of envisioning these black swan like events, but that doesn't mean they don't happen. I think the interesting question coming out of this is, are we going to learn any of those lessons? Are we going to build some redundancy into these supply chains so that you can still get toilet paper when you
Yeah.
need it? I
Well,
don't know.
in software, right? We've over the last couple of decades, we've had this little mantra that inventory is bad, right?
Right,
Inventory is not in production, and I kind of get it. That works for software, but it turns out to be quite an imperfect metaphor when you relay it onto the real world, where we're
right.
finding out that some level of inventory is actually quite helpful, right? Because it's
Mm,
that in software, the equivalent is actually like a crumple zone or a buffer.
right,
We're not inventory, right? Which is of course wastage in our world. But I think having a better understanding of that, both for the systems that we're building, so that when they're overwhelmed, they could cope with it because they defer some of the work, but more generally in the systems that we're building, so that when the externalities to that system don't behave as we quite expect they will, maliciously or unfortunately, the systems are resilient to them, right? And I think that
right.
we don't. I suspect the people at the cloud hyperscalers building Dynamo or whatever, I reckon they must think about this a lot. But for most folks, we don't. And so we build naive patterns on top of virtualized infrastructure.
Hmm.
And then an AZ goes down and we stop working. And I think a lot of people, even today, maybe listening to this, would be kind of uncomfortable because they know that's how they built their system.
Right,
Sure,
right,
it's replicated across 5 EC2 instances, but they're all in the same data center and possibly in the same rack. So
right,
there's this thing that virtualization gives us the opportunity to do things so much more smartly. And then the systems with which we've built virtualization, deploy virtualization, put barriers around it to kind of discourage some of those sort of safer, smarter moves. It'd be interesting, I don't work at Amazon, some of my friends do, but it'd be interesting. Like, I understand why they have this hierarchical structure, but it'd be also really useful if given virtualization. Sometimes I didn't have to worry about it, right? Like, I think that's more of the model that I feel that like Google are heading, right, with their virtualization stack. It's like sometimes Google just feels like it does stuff on my behalf cleverly,
right,
and like it feels like I don't have to worry quite so much about like how am I multiply redundant? What are the common failure points? And then eventually I give up and just deploy it in US East.
sure.
And I think there's some stuff to be done there that we, independent of the research work going on in databases, but of a similar nature around fault tolerance in those kind of large systems. Because at the moment that does become a problem for the user, and I get the sense that the cloud providers would like to eat into that value and charge by the minute for it.
Right. Well, and I think to a certain extent we become victims of our own success. And because Amazon and Microsoft and Google and others are so good at running these things, and because they don't go down that often, we're like, well, yeah, of course I can just put everything in there. It's all good. And then what do you mean it went down? It's
Yeah.
not supposed to go down. Well, it's still made by humans and mistakes happen and power goes out and there's still all these things we just don't have control over. And I think that's part of it, right? Is understanding the full consequences of those decisions and then reacting accordingly. For some systems being down for an hour is like, okay, whatever. No big whoop. For others, that's millions or billions of dollars lost.
Yeah.
Maybe you should have had some redundancy and not just assume it would all just work.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing, isn't it? You said it was a black swan earlier. It's just a really unlikely event, right?
Hmm.
Um, maybe it's not even quite a black swan. So black swan is something that's genuinely novel. And I think a
Sure.
lot of the outages we've seen, they aren't genuinely novel. They are at some, given some distribution, they are not only not novel, but actually expected
Right.
periodically. And I think that because that period tends to be large, years, hundreds of
Hmm.
years or
Hmm.
whatever, we kind of pull the arm of the one-armed bandit and give it a go. Because it turns out I think those conversations are quite hard to have with people, some people that are paying the bills, right?
Yes.
If they're seeing this as a cost center, and you're saying,
Right.
well, look, I'd like to deploy multiply redundantly. It will probably 2x, 2.5x the price for roughly the same benefit, apart from once in 100 years, it will save our embarrassment.
Right.
Now, at that time, when I'm telling the purse holder that, they're not convinced,
Yeah.
right? Because they also know, because I've told them previously, oh, this cloud stuff's really good. It's run by
Rock
experts, probably
solid.
better than I could personally do. The problem is that completely inverts when we hit that point on the distribution where the unnovel failure happens
Right.
and our system's down. Right now, I think that the purse holder would gladly pay
Right.
2.5x or 5x the price if we
Right.
could save our embarrassment. And I simply don't understand how we can more meaningfully have those conversations. I'm not an economist, I'm not a cloud economist, but it seems to me that even that basic arithmetic tells us something, and we should be perhaps pricing in the cost of embarrassment, which really means kind of business continuity, brand reputation, and so on. Like, if you're the emergency services, you better be doing something better than
Right.
my kind of pathetic iOS app,
Right.
and the cost benefit of that. And I don't think that's well understood yet.
Yeah. Yeah.
Otherwise, we wouldn't be kind of pointing and laughing at people that have kind of done the right thing when it's gone wrong on them.
Well, but we don't talk about this stuff in an undergraduate computer science program, a boot camp, a graduate program in software engineering. These aren't the kinds of topics that come up because, to your point, we're not economists and we're technologists. But I think that part of these changing abstractions means that we also need to understand the consequences of those changing abstractions. And all right, well, if we are down for 4 hours or 8 hours or whatever, how much does that cost us? And we learned some of these lessons, frankly, when 9/11 happened and all of a sudden data centers were wiped out. And then you look at yourself and you're like, well, we never anticipated that. And what are our business continuity needs? I mean, I remember in the aftermath of that, every application we looked at, talked about, architected was all, what's your business continuity plan? When does this system need to be back online? What systems need to be back online before, after, et cetera? So we started talking about it, and I feel like we're going to start having those conversations and are having these conversations in this space too. But it's understanding the ramifications. And yes, I understand it's more expensive, but the cost of not doing it dwarfs the cost of doing it, or vice versa. Because there's some apps where you're right, the redundancy and the engineering it takes to bake in that redundancy is wasted money. Because if we're down
Yeah,
for 4 hours, well, Steve in accounting is going to be a little bummed. Okay, sorry,
that's
Steve.
right. but we don't really have a widespread culture of that, right? So you've
No.
talked about it because you've experienced it.
Yeah.
And I see some organizations, when they have outages, they do these really great root cause analyses,
Yeah.
right, which are partly because they've understood a complex failure mode and they've addressed it in some useful way, partly to restore trust, right,
Mm-hmm.
that this can't happen again, and partly as a PR exercise, like,
Sure.
aren't we good citizens? But, at university, we are taught theory, perhaps, you may have done a module on fault tolerance or that kind of stuff, and that's all great. We're always kind of taught the positive stuff. If you implement the Raft algorithm, you can tolerate up to a minority of failures, all good.
Right, right.
But what we don't have really is a kind of, like, in the same way that, say, the aviation industry really has a very scrutinous attitude towards its accidents, and rightly so. We don't have a culture in our industry, either at the research level or at the kind of industry practitioner level, of talking about bad stuff that happened.
Right.
Right. And it's because if I tell you, oh, I worked on this system that's, at Foobase, my amazing fictitious employer, and we failed in 7.2.1, we failed in this spectacular way that ate all of our users' data. Now, not very many people noticed we managed through, like, backroom boffinry to restore their data 3 days later. But if I tell you that, my stock price tanks. Right. So this is kind of this is pressure.
There's no
that
incentive.
prevents us from learning. There's a disincentive, right?
Right.
And in a way, even at the university level, where you think there'd be more freedom, people want to build new, useful research.
Of course.
They want to show you things that art of the possible, because being the kind of Eeyore of the research world, where all you do is look at failures, must be I mean, maybe it would suit British people because we're quite glum, but on the whole, that's a miserable life, right?
Yeah.
Oh, this is why such a system went wrong. I could have predicted that because I've studied this for 20 years. I'm very unhappy. No one works on like the science that didn't work, and often that stuff gets solved and it doesn't get talked about. So we don't get to learn from our mistakes, which is something an elementary school child knows how to do. And we've lost that skill because of the weird incentives that line up to make us only talk about the positive things and the good impact. Hey, come to my cloud, mate. It's cheap for you to run your app on my cloud. If it breaks, you've got no way of recovering. But it's cheap and it's wonderful. It's much cheaper than Amazon and Tencent. Come to Gym Cloud. It's amazing.
Yeah.
And I've got, it's a weird world. But now that means that the responsibility falls to the likes of you and I to kind of peel back the layers and figure out, hey, actually, in certain situations, which might happen once a year or once every 10 years, this is going to terribly fail and it's unrecoverable. So what do I do in order to potentially head off that situation? And that's hard. And I know it's hard because that's my day job. I think about failure cases a lot, right? Figuring out how to make sure that failed servers, failed hypervisors, whatever, they don't corrupt data or lose data. It's a really hard job. And I spend all my time thinking about it. Whereas most folks who do computering for a living, they've got to think about 100 different things, of which data is just one. And kind of thinking about, like, how do I make my platform fault tolerant? That's a hard thing, and I have every sympathy in the world with them for doing the best they can there.
Well, and thank God folks like you are thinking about it, so that folks like me don't have to spend countless mental cycles thinking about it.
We can narrow it down, right? But we can't. We can't ever, by the laws of physics, right? We can't ever alleviate you from thinking about that, because there's always some exception that we can't handle, that we have to pass up.
Right.
And I think eventually, even the folks at your level, you're like, well, okay, I'm at the app level. There's only so many things I can tolerate before I have to pass up. But above you, there's people.
Right.
And then people just be like,
what just happened?
Yeah. And it's like, I have a car that can sort of self-drive, and I don't trust it, right? Because I know that it's programmed when it gets in a panic, like when it's in the worst possible situation, its protocol is to hand back control to me when I haven't been fully paying attention. So I'm going to need half a second to reboot, and what am I about to crash into? And too late, right? It's so I think that's that pervasive model of throw it up and somebody above me will figure it out has kind of crossed over into more safety critical parts of our world. And I'm not sure we're ready for that.
Well, there's a couple of interesting things I'd love to poke at there, but the culture of looking at failures is something I've thought a lot about in our industry, because we all know there's failures. We've all been a part of failures, and yet we do not talk about it. We might talk about it internally, maybe But even that, I've seen a lot of resistance to organizations ever admitting that, the foo project went badly. It's just, no, everything's great. And I mean, I was on one project where a success outcome was that we successfully implemented what they call it, agile fall, because we used an agile methodology within, sort of this pervasive waterfall model, or, it's like, okay. But I think about, I live in here in the Twin Cities, and we had a bridge fall down during rush hour traffic. And thankfully, because of just the right set of circumstances, the bridge was under construction or they were doing some repairs, so there weren't as many cars on the bridge as there normally would have been during rush hour. So, tragically, 8 people died. Could have been much worse. And I know for a fact that engineering students and engineers, practicing engineers around the world, studied that. And when the NTSB report came out saying this is what happened, again, engineers and engineering students around the world studied that. We don't have that. And I think to our own detriment. And I think this is why we keep making the same mistakes, because we don't have that culture of a true post-mortem kind of a scenario of, well, geez, we're going to talk about this because for the betterment of, and I don't know how long we can maintain that, because software is eating the world. And so we are so dependent on software, left, right, up, and down. If we don't start developing that in some way, there will be some tragic outcomes, and a proverbial bridge will fall, and real lives will be harmed by that.
For sure. I look, not to denigrate those folks who do real world engineering, but I suspect there aren't terribly many ways of building a bridge, right? I think there are designs that probably are in use the world over. Maybe there are 50 of them or 100, right?
And some have been around for thousands of years.
And exactly, and have still, they haven't yet found the thing that will cause them to fall over like dominoes.
Right.
Software's a bit weird, right? Insofar as every system that you've ever built has had some of the same old in it, but it's also had a bunch of unique stuff. And so we can study the same old. You can say, foo database 7.2.1 broke in such a way, and we've learned from that, and now databases around the world have improved. But the bit that you've done, if that causes the catastrophic failure, you may learn all there is to know about that failure, and it may be completely unportable onto your next project where the design of the system is completely different. So I do think that the real world folks, part of their culture of learning is that it's transferable, right? That a bridge breaks in the Loire Valley is similar to a bridge that broke in Humberside or what have you. There's some commonality there, and for us, it's less so. Maybe we get more like that as the cloud providers eat up into our stack, and it does become more kind of standardized blocks. That dream of standardized components being plugged together to produce viable software systems, but we're probably not there yet, because as we sit here right now this evening, millions of lines of special snowflake code are being written around the world that are just for that one system, right?
Well, and I've been doing this long enough that I'm always skeptical anytime someone gives these extraordinary claims of, well, it'll all just be building blocks and you'll click them together like Legos. I remember when Java beans were supposed to solve that problem, and so you'll never build this ever again, because you'll just be doing a visual thing, dragging and making connections between your UI and this bean that you bought from me, and it's like, yeah, no, that never came to be. And so I'm skeptical. But by the same token, we are seeing different levels of abstraction. Very few people write their own operating systems, compilers, things of that nature, and we have kind of reached that stage where, what do you mean you're running your own servers? Why would you be doing that? And so we're seeing more of that, to say the least. So dependency hell, Darth Vikes says, yeah, and I mean, that's the other interesting aspect of this too, is that we are exposed to more of that than we probably realize. I mean, Log4j was a perfect example of that. How many people had never even heard of Log4j? And then all of a sudden, like, what do you mean my system has a vulnerability? And what is it? And what do you use it for? And who maintains it? How many more of those do we have floating out there? That won't be the last.
The weird thing about that, on the day when that all kicked off, I obviously we at Neo4j we use Log4j in some of our versions, so there was a real scramble to kind of get that sorted, and 24 hours later we got it sorted, got a new release out, and then there was the follow-up where we're like, okay, let's go on this merry-go-round,
do it again.
Right? Yeah, not a problem. That's what software devs are paid to do. That's what the organization exists to do, right? So it's not, I'm proud of my team for turning that around quickly. However, the thing that I didn't foresee was after the first day getting home, my 9-year-old telling me about Log4j. Now, he's not a Java programmer. He loves programming in Scratch. He's really into Scratch, really likes it. He does things that frankly perplex me. I'm like, how do you do that
Right,
again?
right.
But from he'd been exposed to this through Minecraft.
Of course.
And he's like,
Of course.
Dad, I don't think my PS5 is susceptible to Log4j, right? And I'm like, what now? And he then tells me about how
Wait a
Java
minute.
Minecraft clients, which have Log4j in them, are
Uh-huh.
now being hacked through this vulnerability. And, that people are popping up dialogues on strangers' screens with,
Awesome.
perhaps unpleasant messages and so
Of
on. So
course.
this is a 9-year-old that's avid Minecrafter and Scratcher. He's now telling me about the Log4j vulnerability and how serious it is. I'm like, welcome to my work life, son. It feels like almost Victorian that at 9 years old, you're down the pits with me.
Mm-hmm. Oh my God, that's hilarious. Well, I mean, I do think that, again, as software eats the world, people are becoming more aware of these things. And I mean, that to me is one of the biggest shifts that I've seen in my career. And I think you and I talked about this last time, but when I first came out of university, CIO said to us, "Hey, we're a cost center. We're here to support the business. If you're looking for a technology company, we ain't it." And fast forward 20-ish years, a totally different CEO, CIO, totally different organization. We're a technology company that happens to be in retail. And that has some interesting ramifications and some interesting consequences. And again, as I mentioned, like software eating, where like I probably owe, can't remember who coined that, but I'm sure I owe him royalties at this point. I can see his face. I'm blanking on his name, but it, it it'll be interesting to see what changes that forces on us. This sort of just slap it together and throw it out there probably isn't going to be sustainable forever. I mean, there's going to be some amount of, I don't know if it's professional certification. Do we have to be like real engineers where we have to pass the proverbial bar exam in order to be practicing software people? And what does that look like? But I don't think the sort of slapdash, baling twine, and duct tape, and I think it'll work this time, has a particularly long runway.
No, you're probably right, but is it still like that, right? When I remember, building systems back in the day that felt a bit like that, right?
Sure.
This works, which was sort of a synonym for, and that's what's going into production now, right? It sort of
It
worked on my
compiled.
laptop. Yeah, it
Yeah.
compiled,
Yeah.
right? But that's a legacy from perhaps university education, where the
Right.
thing that compiles and works well enough to get you through this module, that's good enough,
Good
right?
enough. Ship it.
But I noticed, particularly during my time when I was with ThoughtWorks, and I think thereafter, I just became more aware of it at ThoughtWorks because it's their bag. But that whole idea of building software better and kind
Yeah.
of automating so that those externalities don't bite you so often, and that the rough edges in your software and your design and your implementation aren't so bad, and you catch them earlier and so on. It seems to me that's accelerated. You talked earlier about nothing much changes in 2 years. And you're right, at 2 years at ThoughtWorks, we were talking TDD, and then Dan North would say BDD, just as
Just a
a
troll.
kind of provocative thing because he wanted a different letter or something. But
Yeah.
you can see the lineage there, right? And
Yeah.
of course,
Yeah. Yeah.
BDD we know is kind of a slightly different design philosophy. But then if you look at that, I pick on the ThoughtWorks folks because they're the ones I'm closest to. Over the last decade or so, they've really doubled down on that stuff, right? I think them and a lot of other folks that are really interested in like the craft of delivering software,
Mm-hmm.
maybe the science of delivering software, but certainly the craft of delivering software, have really figured out how to put a lot of our development methodology, if you'll excuse the pun, on rails. And I don't mean on
Right.
rails in the kind of Ruby on Rails sense, but in the kind of like it's structured. And they've taken away some of that specialness. And when I worked at that company, I still look back fondly. What was nice was every project would be pretty much infrastructurally identical to any other project. Specialisms that you needed perhaps, but nothing was fancy or special. It was all they tried as hard as they could to make the bits that needed to be repeatable in the project and across the project. And then they doubled down on the science of that and made it really, really good. And I think those folks for a relatively small company have really contributed a lot to the industry in that kind of sense. Now, I don't think necessarily when you zoom out a bit, that we have the same kind of discipline, right? We're still like
Right.
code, kind of unique code that works in my situation is still there. But I
Yeah.
think, that kind of discipline is eating its way up the stack, I think.
Yeah. Well, sure. I totally agree. I think things have improved. It's not evenly distributed. So
No.
my friend, my colleague Layla tweeted this out this summer. I think I'd have to dig back to find the tweet, but she was visiting a website and it was down for maintenance, and basically her response was, "You're kidding me, right? Like, what do you mean you're down for maintenance?" And as someone who you just look at, expectations have changed, and so my response to her was, well, again, distribution patterns of software have not been evenly distributed across the world here. Some people don't understand that there's more than one way to do deployments, but it's getting better. It's not all the way where it needs to be, and I'm curious to see what is it going to take to sort of drag some of these more recalcitrant organizations into, yeah, you do need to start automating these things, and the way you've always done it just will not work anymore. I'm sorry.
If I had an answer for that, I genuinely would share it.
I know. And
But I think
well, no,
the
we would write the book first, and then we'd start pitching the conferences. There'd be an organization designed. We will solve this problem for you.
you are good at this. But I
I
think,
know.
look, some of it comes from the people practicing, because they have the best
Yeah.
view. The problem is, if I'm a developer and I'm grumbling about our build and deploy, that's a developer grumbling about build and deploy. They grumble about everything. The very notion
Right.
of a software engineer is that we're beset by problems, because in
Yes.
the absence of problems, we don't have a job. So, we're always talking about the problems that we face. I think sometimes it's hard to discern those kind of problems which are, endemic and structural, versus those ones that have annoyed me this morning before I've had my second cup of coffee. I think there's something there that I can't quite put my finger on, but when, being able to express the I think it's the first time I've used this phrase in our chat, but express the business value of something like build and test automation,
Right.
is beyond a lot of us, right? And we rely on third parties to do that. I have to get Dan North in to explain,
Yeah.
because he does it so eloquently, but not many of us are blessed with that kind of eloquence as to why there would be business value in this stuff. And we end up, therefore, just making the best of a bad hand.
Yeah. Well, and I think that gets back to our comment about, we're not economists. We're not trained that way. We are trained to solve technical problems, and we're good at that. That we enjoy that. That's what it takes to do this job well. But I have to be able to communicate that to decision makers in a way that isn't down in the weeds. In much the same way, if I take my car in to the mechanic, they have an understanding of what's going on that's way beyond my capabilities, but they know how to say to me, this is what we got to do, and it's of course going to cost you several $100s, because that's just the nature of the beast. I think just $1,000 is like my baseline for any time you bring a car in, because then if it's lower than that, you feel better. And if it's a little higher than that, it's like, well, it's only a little more than I thought it was going to be. So it tends to kind of keep your brain in the right space. But yeah, that's a fascinating point. I think part of that is just us being able to express the necessity of this, and the cost of not doing it. Status quo isn't free. And there is a cost to the way, if you choose to be down for maintenance for 48 hours, there's a cost to that. So it's expressing that in a way that the decision makers get it.
Look, I know we're getting towards the end of our chat, but you prompted yet another point in my head, so I'm going to get this one out. One other thing I'd point out on the flip side of that, developers or software professionals discounting their own cost, right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to build this because if I build it, it's free. Versus I'm not going to pay for that build automation tool or that database or that framework, because that costs $20,000, which is an extraordinary waste of money. Instead, I'm going to spend the next 6 months building an inferior bug-ridden version of same at much higher risk, at much higher cost, really. But I discount that as free. And I think one of the things that as software professionals we need to keep an eye on is, like, we understand that we are also a cost.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's cheaper to spend money than to spend time.
Oh, that's a good point for us to probably declare victory on. We didn't even open source is free. Yeah, kind of. Yes and no. I mean, there's trade-offs there too. We didn't even get a chance to talk about Doctor Who, so maybe we'll have to have a third episode. I did just finish
my sentence with the word time, so I did hope that would lead you into Doctor Who.
I mean, we can go into that, but I know it's late for you, so I'm happy to declare victory. But I mean, I did wear,
I love it. I love it. Yeah. And in the before show when we were chatting, I do have the same T-shirts. I just outgrew it.
It's fine.
Not mentally or spiritually, just I just got big.
I, I
So
think I think you just need a new instance of shirt.
that's fine. Yeah, that's right. Now everything's virtualized, right? I can just
Right.
move the slider to the right and I'm back in the game.
That's so much easier than making yourself smaller.
I mean, obviously, we know the game, right? You only ever slide to the right
Only get
and
bigger.
pay more money. The left slider doesn't work in those user
Doesn't.
interfaces.
There's like a governor on it. Doesn't it's a clutch. Doesn't allow it to go backwards.
Wonderful. Right, next time we'll talk about Doctor
We'll
Who.
we'll do Doctor Who next time. We'll figure that out. Well, thank you so much, my friend. It was a pleasure. I
Pleasure.
look
Thank you for
forward
your
to having coffee or beer or dinner or lunch or high tea or
all of the
whatever week
above.
in May when I finally get back across the pond. This is the longest I've gone
Fantastic.
without visiting the UK, so I appreciate that. Please join us next week. We'll have Sergi from the Spring IO conference will be my guest, so I'm looking forward to talking about that, and then hopefully I can find a way to connive a way to Barcelona out of that deal. So we'll see what kind of trouble that gets me into, but
It's not a bad job, is it?
it's not a bad job. No, it's not even a real job. It's amazing that I get to do this. So I'm blessed. Well, thank you, my friend. Have a good evening and stay warm. And I will we'll see you in a few short months, hopefully.
Look forward to it, mate. Have a good one, won't you?
Cheers.